Today I'm going to piss you all off. Let's talk politics. So today's video has been titled The Politics of Freedom. And the reason I've titled it this is because I think it's very important at this stage in the world, as I've mentioned in numerous previous videos, that we can come to a common understanding about that which we can all agree upon, and make everything else a matter of personal choice and the responsibility of individuals to self-organise if they find that they have individual problems that need to be addressed. Before we go any further, I'm going to define what I mean by politics and political. And my own personal definition is that politics and the political is anything that is to do with a body of people, a community or a group, anything that concerns more than just the individual. And this could encompass many ideas, from the social to the economic, the management of resources. There's all sorts of things that might come under this umbrella, but that's not for me to define. That is for a group of people from a diverse spectrum of backgrounds and political leanings to discuss amongst themselves and figure out what they can all agree upon. Before I go any further, I'm just going to discuss the idea of a political spectrum. It's been described in numerous different ways. You've got the idea of social structure, of economic structure, and then authoritarian and libertarian ideals as well. This would necessarily produce a cube-shaped space, a volumetric space in which we could define various different parameters and place people in different quadrants of this cuboid structure, so to speak. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to consider a more traditional two-axis political diagram. I'm going to have a quick look at it right now. I'm going to start off with the traditional left-right political divides. On the left side, you've got the idea of socialism, and on the right-hand side, you've got ideas of capitalism, conservative and liberal, in more sociological terms rather than economic terms. And this is important where we start to, make a case for the difference between someone who describes themselves as conservative and someone who describes themselves as a capitalist. They are necessarily two different axes. They're very, very hard to obviously display in a two-dimensional space without, discarding the authoritarian, libertarian angle of the political spectrum as well, which I think is a more important distinction than necessarily the socio-economic structure. Ideas of liberalism and conservatism are social ideals. That talks about the way we structure our society in a social context rather than in an economic context. This is where you get the ideas of, traditional nuclear families on the conservative side of things, and tend to have more religious allegiances, again, on the conservative side, again, but not always. Generally speaking, tend to have more religious people on the conservative side of things. And then over towards the liberal side, you've got, more progressive ideas of family units. You've got people who generally tend to be more scientifically minded. Again, in general, I'm not trying to make sweeping assumptions about anybody who defines themselves as being on either side of this political spectrum. In the economic sphere, we can still look at the left, right, and the left-hand side of the system here. What we've described previously as the liberal side could also be described as the communist side of it, the socialist side of the dichotomy. As we come across towards the right, this is what's normally traditionally described as the capitalist side of the coin. And again, they tend to go along with your traditional liberal and conservative ideals. But again, you've got to remember that these things are distinct from that. We could have this as a three-dimensional space rather than a two-dimensional space, which it is going to become now, a fully two-dimensional space with twin axes. So let's add another axis to this graph now, and now we've got the idea of authoritarianism and libertarianism. In these ideas, as well as having your traditional conservative and liberal sides of the argument and your capitalist or socialist sides of the argument, you've also got the idea of how much influence do you want your system of organisation to have on the individual lives of people. And that's an important distinction to make, because you can be authoritarian and very, very conservative and very, very capitalist, or you could be very, very authoritarian and very, very liberal or very socialist. In fact, a lot of people would argue that most of the communist regimes that we've seen are, very, very extremely authoritarian regimes. They are not stepping out of the way of the common folk. There's an awful lot of influence on government entities on everyday lives. And for me, this is the more important distinction. How much influence do we feel that governments should have on our daily lives? How much of our autonomy are we willing to give up in order to gain security? And at what point have we overstepped that line? So where do I sit on this political spectrum? Well, I'll tell you quite honestly, I don't think I fit into any traditionally conservative, liberal, socialist or capitalist camps. I find myself quite central in a lot of places, and a lot of people consider that to be a dirty word. But I don't. I don't consider the idea of centrism to be dirty. I think that allows you a freedom of thought when you take a more pragmatic viewpoint on politics and, the way society governs its affairs. It allows you to be very free thinking and to take the ideas from both sides of the coin and try and unify them and bring them together in a manner which will allow everybody the freedom to organise themselves however they see fit. So as much as people might have very, very left-wing ideals, be very liberal, but also be very libertarian and sit down in the bottom corner here, I don't think you could necessarily have a government structure that would sit in either of the extremes, just by the nature of libertarian ideals, which is that government should have as little impact on everyday life and on everyday decisions as possible. It should simply be a system by which collective problems can be solved, by which we can all identify that there's a problem that needs to be dealt with by the community, and then come to a conclusion as to how we are going to do that without infringing even the sovereignty of a single individual and the rights of self-governance of that individual. So in reality, I think, sure, you can have, authoritarian right and authoritarian left governments, but you can't have libertarian left or libertarian right governments. That necessarily goes against the whole idea of libertarianism. If we're looking at the actual space in this political graph where you could have a government structure that was aligned with these principles, I think you'd find it appears more like a wedge, like an inverted pyramid. And as you become more libertarian, you necessarily have to become more centrist, because you have to be able to get to those things on which the left and the right both agree and never step outside that purview. So I wouldn't describe myself as a left or right, or as conservative or liberal. I think that both camps have an awful lot to bring to the political debate and to discuss about the solutions to the things that we can all identify as problems, because left and right both ultimately are in the same environment. Those with left-wing beliefs and those with right-wing beliefs exist in the same space. The difference in a lot of cases is what they perceive to be the problem. And a lot of these minor differences, I think they are ultimately minor, are splitting hairs on perhaps secondary problems which both have the same primary issue. So a lot of conservative people feel that we, need to have lower levels of immigration because of, job issues and money and all the rest of it. And then people on the left don't think that the immigration is a problem, but still recognise that the money's an issue. So what we've got to do then is look at ultimately what is everybody worried about when it comes to, this idea of immigration. What are people really concerned about? Well, they're concerned about not being able to make a living. They're concerned that the economy is not going to be able to support them as well as all these other people. So that's where the ultimate fear comes from. And the argument about, whether we should have any immigration or not is kind of moot, because that's not the actual problem that we're supposed to be dealing with. The problem we're supposed to be dealing with is how to look after the poorest in society and make sure that the people who want to contribute to a society are actually able to do so without feeling like they are disadvantaged in the very land in which they were, born and raised and brought up to be. So without getting into too many of the, issues between the left and right, what I want to say here and get everyone to really think about is, can we come to a point of agreement in the middle? And I'm discussing this very, very simply in terms of left-right political dichotomies. I mean, let's put one up right here. Let's make a little Venn diagram. This is also known as the Vesica Pisces, where the two circles intersect. On the left-hand side over here, we've got all the things that the political left, the liberals, the socialists, that they all, believe, or a given socialist believes. On the right-hand side, we've got all the things that the capitalist believes, traditionally conservative person believes. If we look in the middle, there is a space where those two ideals overlap. And for me, that is the space where the libertarian government operates, where the minimalist structure, which allows us to all make our own decisions and to all build our lives however we think will benefit us most. And we can make this, ultimately it's not as simple as I've put it out here. We could add another circle and another circle and another circle and another circle. And what you find is, as you add more circles, as you add more perspectives, as you add more philosophies about the way the world should be constructed, what happens is this space in the middle gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. The things upon which everyone can agree is reduced and simplified. And that is why we need to be very, very careful about adopting groupthink ideas, and we need to be very careful to consider everything that we choose to believe. We need to be prepared to reconsider, and we need to be prepared to reevaluate, and we need to be prepared to change our minds about things. Because it's no use 1,000 people thinking the same. What's much, much better is to have many, many people thinking differently and allowing the things that can be proven to be true to get smaller, get those facts down to the very, very basics. And the more people involved, the smaller that space becomes and the less influence that the government has on everybody's lives. It's very simple. A libertarian government cannot infringe the rights of any single individual. So let's expand this idea out a little bit. A lot of people will say, how do you have a functioning society with so little control? How do you make sure that the species as a whole thrives and survives. That's supposed to be the purpose of a government, right? It's supposed to ensure the longevity of a people. But I think that any individual who asserts that they know exactly the best way of doing things is quite arrogant. Everyone can have their own perspectives on things, but to presume that you know what is the best for another person, a person that you aren't, a person that whose life you have not lived, and a person whose mind you are not within, I think that is a notion which is a threat to us all. It's not just dangerous, it is a threat. And it comes from a place of fear. What we need to do in reality is trust that the checks and balances are existent in nature to allow that system to thrive naturally. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that if we step out of the way of many individuals and we allow people to live their lives as they see fit without harming other people, to raise their children as they see fit, to eat the things they think that they should eat, to look after their bodies in the way they think they should be looking after their bodies. What we will find is that those who are most successful, those who thrive, are more likely to succeed in life in general, and the practices that work will be adopted, and those that do not work will be left by the wayside. It allows a generational improvement on the one before, and allows us to collectively and competitively and cooperatively find the correct solutions. Competition and cooperation are not necessarily opposites. A system of competition allows a group of individuals to cooperatively find the best result. It makes no sense for inefficient practices to continue. What makes sense is for them to be superseded by more efficient practices, by things which make the lives of everybody better, that make things easier, that make things of higher quality and of greater robustness. Once we step out of the way of individuals and at the same time make them responsible entirely for their actions and subject to universal morality as determined by a collection of their peers, then we can really start to allow the human race to evolve in a way that will bring more freedom to us all. It will bring more exciting lives to us all, and it will bring more fulfilling lives to us all. So what we really need to do is figure out what fits through that small hole in the middle of this diagram, with each one of these circles considered to be one of us with our own separate view. What do we all agree on? And allow the government to operate in that space, and that space only. Thanks very much for watching, if indeed you still are, if you did like the content. As always, don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the thumbs up and notification bell. When you set it to all, you make sure you're always kept up to date when my videos go live. Take care of yourselves, guys. Don't forget to stay free, think free, and as always, act free. I'll see you next time.